Hello there, I'm Brian Taylor, and welcome to the very latest edition of my Herald podcast. Now, on the show today, just two topics. We'll look at the COVID controversy, look at that particularly with the Herald's health correspondent, Helen McArdle. Welcome to Helen. But first, of course, Ukraine. As we come on air, the government of Ukraine has advised its 3 million citizens who live in neighboring Russia to leave their homes and return to Ukraine. We'll discuss Russia's initiative, Russia's approach, and the West's response. And there's renewed controversy this lunchtime over the Moscow-backed RT channel, which broadcasts in the UK, including its guest presenter, Alex Salmond. I'm joined for all of that by Herald colleagues David Leask and political correspondent Kathleen Nutt. Welcome to both. David, first, maybe just update us where we are. We're on the latest on the ground in Ukraine and Russia, if you'd be so kind.
Well, the latest is that we have a state of emergency essentially announced in Ukraine. Clearly, they are bracing themselves for something. We're not quite sure what. And this has been, I guess, the story all along here. Nobody quite knows what is afoot.
Do we know whether the US president describes it as the beginning of an invasion? Is that, in the sort of language we should be using? An incursion, an invasion, preparation for an invasion? Where are we in terms of the actual military buildup?
Well, we have 100,000 or more soldiers. Some figures suggest 150,000, perhaps 100 formations of armored columns surrounding Ukraine from the north, the east, the south, and the west, because Russia has bases all around Ukraine. That we have a huge force, something like 2/3 of the entire available Russian military, one of the largest kinetic military forces in the world, all poised to strike. But we don't know what they're going to do. Now, we might think in the old days that bells would toll above churches when war was declared. Sheepish ambassadors would deliver a note. But essentially, Russia and Ukraine have been at a sort of war for 8 years now.
Yeah.
So every new change is incremental rather than one big thing happening.
In terms of, Kathleen, of global reaction, as I mentioned the US president there, he's talking about it being an invasion, a sort of use of a key phrase that is his determination as to what is happening. In terms of what's happened from the UK, we've had sanctions applied to, I think it's 5 banks, 3 individuals, and more to come on Russian politicians. But some opposition parties saying it's nowhere near enough. Take us through that one, if you would.
Yes, the Prime Minister gave a statement to the Commons yesterday and announced these sanctions against 5 individuals, or 3 individuals and 5 banks, rather. And his statement was broadly welcomed by opposition parties at the time, but their main sort of criticism was that they didn't go far enough, and that was also an issue that was taken up by Nicola Sturgeon yesterday in Holyrood and reiterated today. Some Labour MPs have been saying that some of these people have been sanctioned already by the US for a number of years. The Prime Minister seems to suggest that he hadn't gone further because he was in lockstep with the allies.
Said that again in the Commons just about an hour ago when he was being questioned on that. There's more to come. He said. Yeah.
He's very much saying there's more to come, but on the fact that it's limited at the moment, he seems to be suggesting that is a policy that they've all agreed, that the allies at UK, US and EU have agreed.
That's interesting.
So that seems to be a suggestion, and they are very keen to work together and have a common front. And they say that it's in Russia's interest to sort of try and cause splits within the US, the EU, and the UK. I think what has been happening, there's been a little bit more grumblings from Labour and the SNP today in the Commons. They have raised much more of an issue about alleged contacts between the UK government and Russia. So I think Ian Blackford raised issues about party donations, Conservative Party donations coming from Russia today. So that, I think that's probably an issue that's going to go a lot further. I think the Conservative government will come under a lot more criticism for connections it's had with very wealthy Russians.
David, let's Helen, please pile in if you wish. I mean, you're here primarily to talk about COVID, but if you want to jump in, please do. But David, let's talk about sanctions, and then let's talk about what Russia is doing, and then let's talk about why Russia is doing what the President Putin is doing. The sanctions. I mean, presumably the concern on sanctions from the US, the UK, and everyone else is that if you sanction Russian companies, if they are trading with the West, all you're doing is hitting the Western economy, and specifically with regard to the Germany's interruption to the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. The likelihood of that, as some Russians pointed out, not all that gently, is that you push up gas prices in the West. So it's about trying to avoid shooting oneself in the foot. Tell me about that.
Well, I think we've got this idea, don't we, of Russia as being somewhere really far away, something that's not connected with us. I was watching Putin on Russian television the other night, and he was a bit late. And before he started speaking, there was a run of adverts. It was Snickers, it was Café Noir. It was for things that we are providing to the Russian economy. The Russian economy is one of Europe's biggest, despite people insisting on measuring it in crude GDP terms. It's a big country, the biggest country in Europe. It is intimately connected to our economy. It is it fuels the engine of the European economy with its gas and with its oil. It is not some minor place. This isn't some dispute with, for example, a Serbia of old. This is a major economy and a major part of our continent. And
I'm right in saying that if we try to damage the Russian economy or sectors of the Russian economy, which is what sanctions are intended to make it difficult for Russia so that it withdraws from military action. If we do that, we could be causing damage to our own economy in the bygoing.
Well, there will be cost to this. I mean, even in simple terms, a lot of middle-class Russians, for example, are traveling, going on holiday. If we see visa restrictions, by which I mean both the visas which people use to enter the EU and the UK, but also the credit cards which they carry, then we're going to have fewer tourists from one of the biggest sources of tourism in the EU, in Europe. If we, for example, start cutting off Russian banks from the wider Western economy, that will have a devastating effect on Russia, but it'll affect us too. And of course, from a Scottish perspective, we're a big energy supplier too. Yes. We could see a big change in our economy as suddenly the North Sea, which perhaps we were looking at running down, becomes incredibly important to the energy security of Western Europe. So these are not minor things that are happening. This affects everybody, wherever they are, and especially in an energy country like Scotland.
I would actually come in on that issue about energy prices. I mean, there's obviously a concern that energy prices could end up going up as a result of the Ukraine-Russian crisis, and already actually the energy prices are going up, and there's a cost of living crisis in the UK. They're going up by something like £600 or £700.
And fuel, vehicle fuel at the pump is at its highest ever level today.
Yes. So I think from what I've heard, Russian gas supplies something like 30% of European, that's EU gas. I think very much smaller levels in Scotland. I think it's only about 5%, and most of UK gas is from Norway and also from the North Sea. But there is this, obviously there is the very clear political will to reduce, our dependence on North Sea fossil fuels and expand renewable energy sources. But at the moment, we haven't got enough renewable energy to fill any possible gap.
Kathleen, is it particularly difficult for the Prime Minister that one of the key areas of investment by wealthy Russian individuals is London, and has been for many years?
Yes, well, I think that's it is potentially a very awkward situation for him. Ian Blackford asked him in the Commons today. I raised this issue with you in 2017 about there's a sewer of Russian dirty money flowing around London, and you didn't do anything about it. And the Prime Minister said he is now acting, but I suppose the question is, why didn't he act back in 2017 when this was first brought to his attention?
Yeah, again.
So I think this is going to be an ongoing thorn, I think, on Boris Johnson's side about Russian money in the UK.
Helen, what's your take? Observing this, not your area of specialism, but there's been there's huge anxiety. I mean, citizens in Scotland are anxious about this. It would be a war on European territory should it, heaven forfend, come to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point as well about the bills is probably. It strikes me as that seems like that's going to be the most immediate impact on people here.
Yeah.
And that's what people are concerned about. I'm not sure how conscious people are of what the impact would be. I mean, yes, it's a war in Europe would be a terrifying prospect, but I'm not sure people are necessarily all that engaged with what that would mean for us here beyond the impact on our own.
I agree. Yeah.
Our own household bills. We're not talking about nuclear war here.
No. Well,
I think people are there is that kind of sense of, well, it's happening over there, so will it affect my day-to-day life beyond my bills?
But your point is right. It adds to the sense of insecurity that there is in Europe and global. And thanks, David. Let's talk about what President Putin is doing and not doing. He has been given a sanction by the Russian Parliament to allow Russian troops to leave the boundaries of Russia, and yet we're not certain yet whether is there actually an incursion into the two areas of eastern Ukraine that he claims are sovereign states, or is it waiting? As you say, he's got them waiting. Why doesn't he just pile in with? President Biden calls it the beginning of a Russian invasion, but it's all very tentative. What's going on in your view with regard to that?
I have no idea, and I would almost go as far to say I wouldn't believe anyone who said they did know what was going on just now.
Good one.
Good call. I think what we're talking about is important to understand here what these places are.
Yeah.
And one of the strange things for a Scottish audience is perhaps something we forget about is that these two areas of eastern Ukraine are areas of substantial British settlement.
Uh-huh.
That Luhansk was in fact essentially a Scottish creation. Donetsk was formerly called Yuzovska, Hughestown. These are places which were part of, brought into the Russian Empire. They were called New Russia at one time. They were populated by people from other countries. Luhansk its main street was called English Street because just in the way that we confuse Russians with Ukrainians, it confused English people with Scots. But lots of steel workers from Scotland went there. This sounds flippant and stupid to talk about now, but I recall 8 years ago writing a story about a humorous attempt by people in Luhansk for their region to join an independent Scotland, because, of course, our independence referendum was at the same time as all of the shenanigans that went on in Ukraine. So these, although they may seem like remote places, they're actually places that are intimately connected to our own history. There are places that are not that far away, but there are also places which have their own dynamics. Now, I think one of the big problems we've got just now is the way we talk about these issues. We always want to put us, by which I mean Britain or the West, at the centre of them.
Yes.
But actually, we're relatively, despite these long connections, we're relatively peripheral to this.
I'm going to bring in the others on this, but I'll stay with you for now, David. Let's talk about what is in President Putin's mind, what motivates him. Now, let's be clear, these areas, Luhansk and Donetsk, are part of Ukrainian territory, globally recognized as part of Ukrainian territory. For the president of Russia to send in troops, he is breaking international law. There is little doubt about that. What motivates him to think differently about that? What you've described the situation. What's in President Putin's mind? Is it that he's been neglected in terms of global power status? What's going on?
Well, we can only go by what he says. And I think that's important. What he says his grievances are, what he believes to be the case, what he communicates to his people. And in several long and rambling essays and speeches, he's tried to set out his views. Now, we often think that he must have a big grievance with the West, with NATO, with the EU, with America. But actually, he has a grievance with another Vladimir Lenin. He's really mad about the Bolsheviks. So we often start talking about how Putin wants to recreate the Soviet Union. But boy, is he mad about communism. He thinks that the people who were in charge of what he thinks of as Russia 100 years ago made terrible mistakes. And in his view, those mistakes were essentially the nationalities, the national policy of the Bolsheviks, allowing each of these countries, as we might think of them now, to have their own Soviet republics. And that meant that when the Soviet Union collapsed, Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia became separate nation states. His view is that's a mistake because he thinks of these three nations as essentially being one. He doesn't think of Ukraine in the way that perhaps people in Britain think of France. He thinks of Ukraine in the way that people in England think of Wales. In fact, more than that, he thinks of it as being the cradle of what he says is Russian civilization. And there's a term, forgive me for using some jargon here, but which we should be familiar with, which is triune nationalism, the nationalism of three nations forming one. That is the fundamental ideological point that Putin always makes. He thinks of Belarus, of Ukraine, and of Russia, that is big Russia, small Russia, and white Russia, as one Russia, all Russias. So when we look at all of this, we have to remember that we're talking about people who do not fundamentally recognize or appreciate or agree with the sovereignty or independence of Ukraine.
Kathleen and then Helen, it also strikes me that in some of those essays that he's read out on air, some of it's very disparate set of views, but in some of them he's talking about his own status. Now, again, without in any way, tolerating the potential incursion into what is the sovereign territory of another nation, which completely breaches international law. Did we miss a trick diplomatically, Kathleen? And perhaps we should have been aware of the grumpiness that was underlying. It's a bit more than that, but the huge discontent and disquiet that was underlying President Putin's approach. Should we have worked him a bit harder?
It does seem to have sort of come up very suddenly. I mean, this war has been going on for 8 years, David said, and yet we're only seem to be sort of getting to a situation now where we're responding in any sort of clear way, and yeah, perhaps. I mean, it's not really my area of expertise, but obviously, Putin is concerned about NATO and whether he sees troops going into Ukraine as a threat to Russia. That does seem to be, a concern that he's raising and that Russians are responding to. I mean, I think Russians overall seem to be quite behind Putin in these measures. Just from looking at polls, there seems to be a sort of, it's not like these measures are unpopular in Russia. I think but
that is partly because, of course, he's representing the incursion as being peacekeeping, something that's dismissed by the US president.
Well, yes, but perhaps also Russians don't also see these areas of Ukraine as part of their own country.
Helen, what's your take on this, Helen?
Well, I think there was a good point, being made at the weekend. I think where people, commentators were saying, if we allow this to happen, this sort of breaching another nation's sovereignty, and where does it stop? I think that's the worrying thing. Where does Putin stop? We had Crimea before, nothing happened. He's now making these incursions, into areas of eastern Ukraine, and trying to portray it as, these are, people that want to belong to Russia and trying to make it a peacekeeping thing from his point of view. But you do have to wonder at what point does he stop? And of course, the other points made at the weekend, drawing comparisons between the kind of appeasement, and maybe that is too simplistic, but there is, nonetheless a little bit of that about it, and I'm not sure, short of these kind of financial sanctions that we're imposing in Russia at the moment, I'm not sure what else we as the West can really do. We are very weakened ourselves.
PM's talked about sending military support to Kathleen. You were keen to come in, yeah?
Yeah, just keen to come in with some of the wider issues. I mean, in the comments yesterday, the whole issue about refugees came up. So if, hopefully there's not going to be a full-blown war in Ukraine, but if there is, then what responsibility will the West have to protect people who are fleeing, and will the burden just be placed on countries like Poland and Slovakia, who are bordering Ukraine, to take refugees in, or whether UK will be obliged to support people fleeing as well?
I just can't help thinking of the Ukrainian people I knew when I was younger in my native Dundee. There's a Ukrainian club there. There's a large settlement, large connections as well with Scotland. One hopes it doesn't come to David. At this point, I'm going to move on to RT in a moment, Russia Today, but just briefly on a kind of a key question. President Putin says central for him is Russian security and NATO membership. When we're tiptoeing around this, and I understand why NATO doesn't want to exclude Ukraine from NATO membership. It's not a very likely prospect, though, is it, in the near future, at least?
Well, essentially, this is what you would call chaff. It's a distraction. It's not real. Ukraine isn't going to join NATO. No. It can't. It's got an armed conflict ongoing on its territory.
Yeah.
I think, I know this sounds daft, but it's important, I think, here to just say Ukraine is a country. It is a real nation.
Absolutely.
It is a place.
Absolutely.
And the areas of Eastern Ukraine we're talking about here voted overwhelmingly for their independence from the Soviet Union.
Yes.
Even the Crimea voted for independence from the Soviet Union, albeit more marginally. Again, this wasn't a close vote in Eastern Ukraine. This was well into the 80%.
Yes.
So
we wanted a way. Yeah.
And I think it's important also to understand that quite often we tend to want to talk about what language people speak, and indeed lots of people in Ukraine speak Russian, lots of them speak Ukraine, and actually a surprising number of them speak both at the same time in a wonderful, wonderful mixture. And I think we sometimes maybe think that because people speak Russian, well, they must be Russians. Well, we're just speaking English just now, and don't be you, Brian, I'm not English. And people in America speak English, and they're not English either. Ireland equally. So it's important to understand that some of the narratives that come out of the Kremlin here are simply untrue. We're not talking about a democracy in Russia. We're talking about an authoritarian state.
Yes.
Therefore, everything from opinion polls down are almost irrelevant. I think it's important also to understand that we talk about this as a Ukraine crisis. This is more of a Russia crisis in many ways. I would point out that 10 years ago, we had mass protests in Russia with tens of thousands of people taking part, precisely against some of the excesses of the Putin regime. Now, you'd be lucky if you get half a dozen very brave people showing up to show solidarity with Ukraine.
Those two developments are presumably not unconnected.
These are not unconnected.
So could this whole crisis be a way of Putin keeping, staying in power, and maybe a way of promoting his own popularity back at home? Is that possible, David?
Far from its not, yeah.
I honestly don't know what's in his mind, and I'm suspicious of anyone who says that they do. However, that is, of course, possible. But it's fundamentally important to see here that Russia was becoming more democratic in the 80s and 90s. It is becoming much less democratic now. We would normally refer to it as an authoritarian kleptocracy, but it's increasingly moving towards something far more sinister. Indeed, rather than just losing its democratic and rule of law institutions, it's losing its entire constitutionalism. Because we've seen some of the pictures coming out of the Kremlin of Putin literally distancing himself from his officials and reprimanding them.
Yes.
Really something more
sitting meters apart, hundreds of meters apart.
Yeah, something really rather like an Iannucci skit rather than something you'd expect in anything approaching a democracy. Whereas Ukraine is it's not a perfect democracy, it's got a lot of corruption and problems, but it's more of a democracy. So comparing the two countries is quite difficult in that respect.
Okay, I'm going to move on soon, but before we move on entirely, Kathleen, bring us up to speed. A controversy breaking this lunchtime. There's the channel RT or Russia Today. It's generally said to be Moscow backed, Kremlin backed, however you describe it. It broadcasts in the UK. One of its guest presenters is Alex Salmond, the former First Minister and former SNP leader. Now, what we've had, the developments we've had, the PM and Nadine Dorris, Culture Secretary, saying that Ofcom should look at RT's license more immediately for Scotland. Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister, says her predecessor, Mr. Salmond, should not be broadcasting on this channel. She says it was never acceptable. It's even more unacceptable now. This is it's a sideshow by comparison with what is happening in Kiev and Moscow. But bring us up to speed on that. Yeah.
Yeah, it is a sideshow, but it certainly come up in the comments today, and Boris Johnson obviously hit back at Ian Blackford over Salmond appearing on RT, even though actually Alex Salmond is no longer a member of the SNP and has got his own separate political party called Alba
Leads his own party,
but again, it was brought up by Jamie Stone as well, partly as a way of embarrassing the SNP too, even though actually Alex Salmond, as everybody knows, is not in the SNP. And in fact, the whole issue was raised first by Stuart MacDonald, the SNP MP, yesterday, who asked Boris Johnson not to, or to end the broadcasting of the RT show. He said, well, actually, that's really up to Ofcom to do that.
But his government has now asked Ofcom to take a look at it. I mean, we had a comment yesterday, wasn't it, from Alapa? It was Neil Hanvey, the MP. You know, he was elected as an SNP member but defected to Alapa. Stressed that Alapa were condemning the Russian incursion into Ukraine, absolutely condemning it straightforwardly. But Mr. Hanvey also said, take Russia's security interests into account, and that drew some criticism from elsewhere.
Yes, I mean, I think there have been historically some people maybe on the left of the SNP who've been a little bit more sympathetic to Russia than obviously the leadership at the moment. And there have been obviously there's an ongoing debate in the SNP about whether an independent Scotland should be a member of NATO. Very much that is the position at the moment, but it wasn't always the case. No. And there has been a background of some discontent. Some SNP MSPs actually even left the SNP and I think went to the Greens over the whole matter. So, and I don't, the issue hasn't come up again at party conference, but I do wonder whether that would still be the SNP's position were it to go to a vote, because a lot of people who've joined the SNP after the independence referendum tend to come from the left. And
I recall the conference in Perth where that decision was taken, that it was taken fairly clearly after what was, as you say, a very, very lively vote. Indeed. Look,
I suppose one of the other aspects about this is that, of course, Ireland is not a member of NATO, and a lot of people in the SNP would like to see themselves as, I suppose, sort of following the Irish model of independence to a certain extent,
if not necessarily the route pursued.
Yes, yeah. Well, exactly. Very much not the route pursued, but
very much not
the end result.
Okay, let's move on. Let's move on to COVID. Thanks very much for your contributions on that, Helen. Let's bring you in for full now. Thank you very much for contributing to the earlier discussion. COVID. We have a statement from the Prime Minister saying, pretty well, individual liberty will rule. The constraints are being lifted. Nicola Sturgeon's statement is decidedly more cautious, at least in tone, than that. Take us through that, if you would. Where are we? What's the latest?
Yeah. So if you compare Scotland and England, from tomorrow, Thursday in England, they are lifting all legal restrictions. So primarily, now if you remember, obviously they had got rid of mandatory face masks and all the rest of it, working from home and so on before anyway. So what they are getting rid of tomorrow is a legal requirement to self-isolate. But I think the thing to understand there is, when we're comparing it to England and Scotland, is we didn't impose self-isolation through fines. They did in England. So that's what they're talking about. They're talking about lifting the legal requirement. So in other words, in England, it's self-isolation is no longer enforceable by fines. In Scotland, it's always been guidance. As time goes on, they're basically leaving it in England that from tomorrow you'll be strongly advised to continue to self-isolate. Obviously, lateral flows will continue to be freely available. That continues up until April the 1st. At that point, that is when it's in England, it shifts to what they're calling personal responsibility. Take that to be whatever you want it to be. Basically, would you self-isolate at home if you had a cold, if you had the flu? Well, maybe you would if you were very sick, but who knows how that will pan out. In Scotland, from Monday, our next big change is that we're getting rid of vaccine passports. Now, again, how much difference will that practically make to day-to-day life? Probably not a huge amount, unless you frequent nightclubs or going to.
I'm personally never away from nightclubs. I'm an habitué of the dance.
So that's a change. I mean, the thing is, I mean, in Scotland, we never did introduce them the way they have in France and Italy and Israel and all these other countries around the world, where it's applied to almost everything from gyms to restaurants. The next big change after Monday will be on March the 21st, which was being dubbed Freedom Day in some of the newspapers this morning.
March to Freedom, yes.
So that is when mandatory face masks will no longer be required in Scotland. So in other words, you're no longer legally required to wear a mask in shops, on public transport, or moving around hospitality venues. We'd have to say to that, again, I'm a little bit skeptical about how much difference that will mean, because I think there's a lot of people even now, you see it when you're going around, in your day-to-day life. I see plenty of people on the Glasgow subway and in my local supermarkets who are already not wearing face masks.
They've given them up, haven't they?
Yeah, and they're not being wrestled.
They think it's all over, to quote another phrase. Okay.
So,
I'm going to come back to Helen in a second. But let's discuss if you like, almost the philosophy, David, behind it. I mean, we have Nicola Sturgeon used the word solidarity. The reason you wanted to keep guides, she said you couldn't make it law because there had to be a proportionate response to make it law. But she appealed to people to continue constraint, to continue, for example, considering others. Basically, she talked about a solidarity. The alternative response that was championed by the Prime Minister, also championed by Douglas Ross in the Scottish Parliament, was one of personal choice, almost individual liberty. You almost have two theories of governance there, don't you, David?
Isn't it fascinating? Two quite different ways of looking at the world. And I guess we'll see how many people fall into those two categories as the weeks develop. It'll be quite interesting, won't it, to look at our country. I'm always quite struck by the difference in cultures around this, around Europe. I think the vaccine passports is a really interesting one, when we've seen Scottish businesses lobby against them, when on the continent, big industrial organizations are going, this is a great way in which we can reassure our customers that they are safe. And it's been really interesting. I think sometimes the messaging from the Scottish money people has been quite interesting and quite different from what we've seen overseas as well. And we'll see how this all plays out over the next few weeks. But will we all be people who wear masks to make sure our friends and neighbours are safe and they're vulnerable, or won't we?
Yeah. Helen, I should have one other one I want to raise with you. Alec Cole-Hamilton, when he was questioning the First Minister, it's this business of the passports. They're no longer mandatory. It won't be obligatory upon venues to take people's details, etc. But it's still open to them to request them if they want. Alec Cole-Hamilton was saying, he's again the vaccine passport. He was saying this was a wrong approach. That's right, isn't it? They can still ask if they feel the need. It's part of this little bit of clinging on, retain. I shouldn't say clinging on. That sounds as if it's desperate. That's the wrong word. Retaining some degree of constraint.
Yeah, but I mean, I would wonder, how many venues will
do it
voluntarily do it, because I think the main bugbear of the passports came down on the economics, on the cost of the admin, if you like, of having someone there to do the checks. If you've got one venue that voluntarily decides to bring in these passports, and another venue doesn't, your choice between two nightclubs, well, so I can't see that very many will implement them voluntarily. I'd also say, I think the difficulty with the vaccine passports here compared to the continent is that because the continent did apply them across the board to everything from restaurants, pubs, cinemas, concerts, just by doing that, they have more of an effect, because we've only applied them ever to a small number of venues that a small part of the population go to. They're never going to have the same effect. The other problem that I think we had in Scotland, and this emerged when the sort of certification first was launched for travel last summer, is quite a lot of people who had been fully vaccinated, when they started to try and get the certificates last summer to travel abroad, which was their initial purpose, a lot of people then discovered that their details were missing from the database. And I think that is possibly one of the reasons why the Scottish government never rolled them out, or were reluctant to, because I think then an awful lot more people across the population would have started to discover, if they needed them for bars and restaurants and things as well, that their details were missing. So.
Kathleen, I bring you in on another controversy, the business of testing. You know, UK government saying the days of free testing are coming to an end. We don't have full details. Nicola Sturgeon obviously wanted to maintain free testing, but she points out that there won't be, if there's no money spent in England, there's no consequential cash for Scotland. Take me through that.
Yeah, the background to this was that Boris Johnson announced that it cost £2 billion alone in January for these tests to be, distributed, given out to people. So it was a massive amount of money. And the issue is that public health is devolved to all the, across the different parts of the UK, but the funding decisions are dependent on decisions taken by England. So if England decides, well, we don't want to continue with free mass testing, then the money is no longer available to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland to do so. So I think as a result of this, the First Minister is very concerned. She does favour the continuation of mass testing, but it sounds to me that she's had to pull back because of the funding decisions. So
she may have to find the money from elsewhere in health resources, which is
she has to find the money from either health resources or other resources, or increasing tax for some reason. She had to find her own money somehow. Okay. But she has announced that they're going to be doing a more targeted testing regime, and she's going to reveal the details of that a bit later. So it could be that people will have free tests still who are in care homes or in hospitals, or perhaps are vulnerable to.
Helen, a related health matter. We've had some pretty, to say the least, poor NHS waiting times. I mean, it's related in that, of course, that the focus has been on COVID, but it's another big pressure for the Health Secretary and the First Minister, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think that is one of the ways that the UK government is justifying this decision on testing. Like Kathleen says, the £2 billion. Well, if we're going to spend £2 billion in testing, can we really justify it now at a point in the pandemic where actually the overall deaths from all causes, not just COVID, are actually lower than average at the moment? So really, do we need to be spending £2 billion in testing? And yes, the figures are absolutely stark. I was having a look at them just before we came on. I mean, we're talking about, if you combine people on waiting lists for inpatient procedures, day case procedures, and outpatient appointments or procedures, we've got over 500,000 people now on that waiting list. If you add on people waiting for diagnostic tests, it's another 140,000 people that are waiting. And just to borrow down into just quite how bad some of the waiting times are. If you look at the inpatient and day case specifically, so that's people waiting to go in for things like a hip replacement or a cataract procedure, there are 5,000, or as of the end of December, 5,300 people on waiting lists who at that point had been waiting for over 2 years. Now, if you look back at December 2019, before the pandemic, there were just 150 people who were on the waiting list who had been there for 2 years.
That's a transformation.
So that's 150 to 5,300. So I think when you look at that, we have got to start turning our attention, I think, to
that. Okay, I'm going to turn my attention. We're almost out of time. I'm going to turn my attention, David, and then Kathleen. It's an entire podcast, and we haven't mentioned Partygate once. That, of course, is a result of circumstances, a result of what Millen called events. We have the COVID issue, and we have this crisis in Ukraine. But will this issue return? Will the struggles facing the Prime Minister return to plague him, or do you think it's beginning to fade into the background?
Well, I was fascinated by the attack line today on Alex Salmond over at RT, with some of the Tories almost suggesting he still belonged to or was the responsibility of the SNP. You could argue the SNP are short of Alex Salmond, but the Tories are stuck with Boris Johnson. Two men of questionable character, let's be honest.
Dear me. Kathleen Nutt.
Well, I actually suspect Partygate has receded. It's not on the front pages at the moment, but I suspect it will come back once the police investigation has been wrapped up and the Sue Gray report is out. But I suppose if it looks likely that the Ukraine-Russian crisis is going to continue, whether then Tory MPs may decide it's not the best time to put in letters of no confidence to the Prime Minister about the Prime Minister. However, saying that, there are something like 300 photographs. So all of these parties, lockdown parties that haven't been released. So that will, if they come out, that could put the story back on the front pages, I think.
It's certainly not there now, and it's not there now for very good reason, that we're facing this huge crisis in the east of Europe, and we're facing what has been a quite remarkable, hideous plague here, dealing with at home. Me speaking as myself, I wouldn't question anyone's character. I wouldn't dare. But there we are. I'm going to call it to a halt.
Not so nice as you, Brian.
No. Thank you very, very much to Kathleen, David, and Helen. I'm extremely grateful. Very grateful to all of you for tuning in. Thanks very much for joining this podcast. Look out for future episodes from me, Brian Taylor. Toodaloo the new.